Hello students, in today's video lecture I'm going to introduce you to the nervous system. We're going to use these notes, but in addition to these notes I'm going to be showing you a lot of really neat images from a PowerPoint. So the first thing I want to talk to you about today are the organs that are included in the nervous system, and you can see them listed here. We have the brain, the spinal cord, and nerves. So let's start with the brain. Here are a few images of actual human brains, fresh from a cadaver, and you can see they are sort of pinkish in color. This is a side view. This side is the front, this side is the back, bottom. This is a view from underneath that you normally wouldn't get to see. So just a couple of interesting facts about the brain. That the brain weighs about 3 pounds. And it's made of over 100 billion cells that are called neurons that are all interconnected together like a network that send messages back and forth and allow us to think and feel and have memories. So we're going to take this information here and put it in our notes. So there we go. I put the weight in and made a mention that it's an interconnected network of over 100 billion cells. Those cells that we're talking about, I'm going to highlight because we're going to learn about those quite a bit. Those are called neurons. And so that is the primary cell of the nervous system that sends the electrical messages that we associate with the nervous system. So before we get too far, let's label and color our brain. I'm pretty sure you know that the brain is number 1 over here. I'm going to grab a light pink color and color it in to the right boundary. And we'll learn about the brain specifically all on its own. Okay, so the brain's going to come all the way down to here and then everything in between. Remember, the brain is contained within the skull in the space called the cranial cavity. Okay, from there, we're going to talk about the spinal cord. So in this image, you can see the brain up here. The spinal cord is this long extension that goes straight down the center of your back. It's enclosed in the vertebral column. It's in that hole inside each vertebra called the vertebral foramen. And I want you to think of it like an extension cord out of the bottom of your brain. So as soon as this cord-like structure leaves the skull, we call it the spinal cord. Here's another image of that. This is a posterior or back view. And you can see the brain up here. The spinal cord starts right underneath the brain as soon as it leaves the skull, goes through the hole. This is a vertebra right here, through the hole in the vertebra. And then around L2, L3, lumbar vertebra 2 or 3, it stops and just becomes a tail of nerves. So as we color on our diagram, I'm going to only take it to a very specific spot. So like I mentioned, it's an extension of the brain outside of the skull located in the vertebral column. It is forming the connection between the brain, which we know is locked up here, and the rest of the body, kind of like an extension cord. So here's our main power and our main integration center. The way it connects to the rest of our body is through the spinal cord. And just like a highway, an information superhighway, we have messages that go into the brain, like up the spinal cord, and then other sections carry messages out of the brain down the spinal cord. So in terms of message travel, the spinal cord is a two-way street. Okay, so I've put the notes here underneath the section for spinal cord. The spinal cord on our diagram is number 2. I'm going to use a yellow color to color it in. In reality, it's not yellow at all. It's kind of a whitish beige color. But I'm going to take my color, I'm trying to stay in the middle, just down to here. As soon as we see this like thickening, strand-like section, it's no longer the spinal cord. And I'm going to go ahead and label it as the spinal cord. Now together, the brain and the spinal cord make up a part of the nervous system called the central nervous system. So that's what I'm going to put on this line up here. You may have heard that terminology before, the central nervous system, but that includes both the brain and the spinal cord. And I'm going to highlight that as well because we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So you can think about how they're located centrally in the body, like on the midline. The last part of the nervous system, the last major organ, are nerves. And those nerves are going to be the thin thread-like extensions off of the spinal cord. But what you can't tell from this picture is that there's actually nerves coming right off of the brain as well. Here's one more picture of the brain and the spinal cord. Here's the brain. Here's the spinal cord. It's only about the diameter of your pinky finger. And let's move on to our nerves. So nerves are wrapped bundles of the cells that are called neurons. Remember, we highlighted neurons before, and I know that doesn't make a lot of sense now, but we'll learn about those in a little bit. So the nerves are the long thread-like extensions. Now, we have different kinds of nerves. If they branch right off of the brain, we call them cranial nerves, and there are 12 pairs of nerves that branch right off the brain. So 24 different nerves coming right off of your brain. Here's an image that sort of illustrates that, and you can learn about the cranial nerves all on their own. They each go to a different place and have a different job. They're numbered 1 through 12, and we usually use Roman numerals, but that's a little bit beyond our scope for today. But all these yellow threads are coming directly off the brain and going to your eyes, your nose, your facial muscles, your tongue, etc. And then there's a couple that actually go down into the neck and beyond. So those are called cranial nerves. Then there's also 31 pairs that come right off of the spinal cord along its length, and we would call those spinal nerves. So 31 pairs and 12 pairs. And a pair is like the one on the right and the exact same thing on the left. Same for spinal cord. So here's an illustration that shows that. These thin threads that are coming off the spinal cord are the spinal nerves, and they'll go, you can see, out to your arms, into your rib cage and the organs of the thoracic and abdominal regions, and then also down your legs. So let's take a look at our notes. I put nerves are wrapped bundles of cells called neurons. Remember, we highlighted neurons before. I'm going to highlight it again. It's the most important cell of the nervous system. We need to figure out what that's all about. There are two main categories of nerves that we looked at. Cranial nerves that branch directly off of the brain, 12 pairs of those. We saw those here. And spinal nerves that branch off of the spinal cord along its length. There's 31 pairs of those. That's what we can see in our diagram here that we're going to label. So everywhere else that you see in this picture, the thread-like connections, those are nerves. And I'm going to color those more of an orangey color. It's traditional to color them yellow, but since I've already colored my spinal cord yellow, and I'm certainly not going to do all of these, but you can see how they extend. Some down the arms, some out to the rib cage, and all of these internal organs here. And then we have a pretty thick tail of nerves off the bottom of the spinal cord that eventually ends up going all the way down the legs, okay, to all parts. Okay, here's some in the arms again. So we see nerves here, and then there's so many of them and they extend for so long that we're going to label those again here. And these technically would be spinal nerves because they're coming off the spinal cord. This picture doesn't have the cranial nerves. So then we have this little blank right here. Notice nerves are not included in the central nervous system. The other sort of division of the nervous system outside of the central nervous system is a sort of a division or a branch of the nervous system called the peripheral nervous system. And peripheral means outer edges. So notice how the nerves branch off the center and they go to all the outer edges of the body. So the peripheral nervous system is made up just the nerves of the body. And I'm going to highlight that. There's a lot more that we can learn about that. Okay, so we're done with the main parts of the nervous system being the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. The second topic I want to talk to you about today is what is a nerve exactly, and how is it different than this cell called the neuron? So if we take a look at one of those thread-like nerves, notice at the top this says nerve structure, and we cut it open and we look inside this nerve, we see that it's actually made of cells called neurons. And all of these items that we're talking about are very long and thin, almost like strands, strings, or think of them like electrical wires because they carry electricity. So the next topic is, what are the parts of a nerve? And we're going to use this picture here in your notes. Nerves are made of hundreds to thousands of cells called neurons. So on the second page, let's go ahead and squeeze that little tidbit right here, because I'm really going to want you to understand the difference between a nerve and a neuron. So that's our concentration for right now. Now, this is the picture we're using, but just so you're aware, this picture from the notes is one of these nerves in super ultra zoom. So see how it's really long and thread-like, almost like an electrical wire? Well, imagine we took a little piece of it and we zoomed in. That's where we get this, and this would extend for, a long way this way and a long way this way, but we've cut it open and we're going to look inside. So the first thing you need to know is that there is several coverings that sort of separate this nerve. You can see into these little groupings. So letter F on the diagram is the outermost covering, and that outermost covering is connective tissue that covers the entire nerve, and it's called epineurium. So the entire nerve is covered by connective tissue called epineurium. That's letter F. So I've put the definition for F, and now I'm going to color in letter F in a similar color. So this is the covering or the wrapping around the outside of the nerve called the epineurium, and it extends all the way around. And then we can see if we look inside the nerve that there's a bunch of these groupings, each with their own, it's like a mini version, each with their own covering. So I said within the nerve are smaller groups known as fascicles. The grouping is the fascicle. Each fascicle is covered by a connective tissue, the exact same stuff that's on the outside, but it's called perineurium, and peri means around, so it's around each fascicle. So G is the perineurium, and these bundles are called fascicles. We'll add that to our picture. Okay, but for G, each fascicle is covered by connective tissue called perineurium. So let's back up a second and make sure we know what a fascicle is. A fascicle is one group of these nerve cells called neurons. So this is the whole nerve, but the nerve itself is made of these little smaller sections called fascicles. It always reminds me of an orange, like the whole orange is the fruit, but when you open it up, it's got sections inside of it. Those sections would be like the fascicles. So I'm just going to label this as one fascicle, and a fascicle is just a group. And then I'm going to go ahead and color in my perineurium around each fascicle. So my perineurium that covers the fascicle is this wrapping here. This one has it as well, and it's sort of telescoped out a little bit so we can see a little more of it. So that's this part as well. And this would extend the whole length of the nerve, so it's not just this little chunk. It would go the whole length of the nerve, and it's sort of like maybe saran wrap or wax paper or some sort of covering around the group. Another fascicle here covered in this perineurium. And then the last one is here. So the orange is the perineurium. The group itself is the fascicle. All right, now we're going to go inside the fascicle. We have one more structure that's actually been grouped to form the fascicle. Next note, individual neurons within the fascicles, that's these little guys here, are surrounded by connective tissue called endoneurium. So we've got one more layer of cover. That's part H. So we can actually label two things. Part H is the endoneurium, the third cover. And then this is the neuron itself. It looks like a little stick. We're going to learn more about it in a little while. This is kind of a cut neuron. But let's go to our notes. So individual neurons within the fascicles are surrounded by connective tissue called endoneurium. I'm going to grab the pen highlighter tool and color these little covers right here and here and here. That's the endoneurium. Now, if I was going to go back and do all this, I would have to zoom way in and color between all these little circles like this, because each one of these neurons is like a little long thread or stick, and it's got this cover around it. So the neuron itself is here, which would be inside, and then it's got a cover. This is like an electrical insulation issue. So if you've ever pulled apart a wire and looked inside, each individual little copper wire has covering around it usually, especially if they're being asked to send, signals to different places or different kinds of signals. So same idea. Okay, I think you get the message. Same would be back here in all these others. So what is this little letter I? I is the neuron. And I know we don't know anything about it other than it's a cell and it looks kind of like a stick. But I is, I'm going to put the main cell of the nervous system is called a neuron. And that's what we've highlighted. This will be our third time highlighting it. So theoretically, I could go back and put a little yellow dot representing my neuron inside each one of these. I do want to show you some pretty cool images of neurons. This is an actual nerve cross-section just like we did, but it's a real one. And it's been stained under the microscope. So the whole perimeter would be covered in epineurium, and then we can actually see these individual bundles. See, they have an F on the slide? That's a fascicle. So here's one fascicle, and it's zoomed in. Around each fascicle is the perineurium, and you can see that like cover right around here. And then these little individual circles, they look kind of like SpaghettiOs. Each dark dot is the endoneurium, and the neuron is inside of it. And here's an even better picture. So these are individual fascicles that we're seeing. These big gaping holes are blood vessels. Look, there's blood vessels in your nerves. And then if we were to zoom in, this is the endoneurium around the neuron. Pretty neat. Look, a smiley face. Okay, so where do we go from here now that we know about our nerve and its structure and how it's made of these neurons? Well, our last topic is to learn about the neuron itself. So if we scroll down towards the latter half of the page, that's where we're going to learn about the neuron. Okay, so all the parts of a neuron are going to be in this box. And remember, this little yellow stick, and I would encourage you to do this, this is here in Zoom. So this little stick, this is what it really looks like when you zoom. It's got this funky end on one side and then the other end, and then there's actually a couple more neurons here. All right, so let's learn about the parts of the neuron. Remember, this is the cell that makes up the nerve. So there's a part of the neuron called the cell body, and that's where you find the nucleus. So that's our first note here. The cell body contains the nucleus and other organelles. And so that's going to be B on our list over here, the cell body, and I'm just going to go ahead and color that cell body in. So I'm going to color all the way around the nucleus, that's the thing in the middle, and I'm not going to color anything about these little extensions or arms. So I would recommend as you're coloring, make sure that you put that same color over here so it's really easy to find. Okay, and I'm also going to go ahead and label this guy, this circle here, as the nucleus of the cell. So you can find the cell body part of the cell really easily by looking for the nucleus. And then notice we have like these branching parts. This looks nothing like any cell you've probably seen before. It has all these little branches, some short ones and one long one. And this is a typical neuron. They actually come in quite a few different shapes, but this is sort of a typical one. Okay, so these branches are like little antennae for the cell. They're very sensitive and they're going to help us sense things in our body, in our environment, etc. And these little short guys are called dendrites. Dendrites. The short extensions off of the cell body that are sensitive to changes. They generate and send electrical impulses towards the cell body. This is the part of the cell that actually makes the electrical impulse. So first, we're going to label A as the dendrites. And second, we're going to color those dendrites. And I don't know if I'm going to do all of them because there's a whole lot. And actually, there can be one neuron, this is a pretty interesting little statistic, can make connections with up to 10,000 other neurons at the same time. So each one of these dendrites could be communicating with another cell, and then similarly on the other end of the cell, the other end has branches too, and they could be communicating with different cells as well. So when I said an interconnected network, I was not lying. It is pretty insane how interconnected these cells are, and actually that's a really good thing. The more interconnected they are, the smarter we are. Okay, so these are the dendrites. Lastly, I am going to put in an arrow, and let me use yellow. I don't feel like that's an electrical color. That represents the electricity that is generated by the dendrites, and it gets sent towards the cell body. So that's an electrical signal. So if these pick up light or sound or heat, if they sense that any of those things are there, they're going to generate an electrical pulse, and it's going to travel through the cell body. And there's really only one way to go after that. It's going to travel down this long arm, much like an electrical wire. So that long arm is called the axon. And I'm going to color through the center until it branches. Okay, notice I've cut my color just in the middle, and right when it branches, I'm going to stop. So the axon is a long arm, and this picture doesn't really do it justice because this can be several meters in length. It can be as long as your leg or as long as your arm. Nerve cells are the longest cells of the body, these neurons. So this could be incredibly long. And it's going to carry that electrical message that we drew before. It's going to carry that electrical message away from the cell body. So I'm going to put my yellow arrows in for my electrical message this way. Remember, it went in, or was started at the dendrites, went through the cell body, and now down the axon. When we get to the end of the axon, we can see that it branches into several different branches. And these branches are called axon terminals. And then there's a little fat spot at the end, it's called a bulb, like a light bulb. So these branches are called the axon terminals. And that's where the cell is able to communicate with another cell. Okay, keep in mind, this is all microscopic, so I know this is kind of a crazy story. So the end of the axon, I'm reading right here, that branches many times can release chemicals called neurotransmitters that can pass a message to another cell. I think you maybe have heard the word neurotransmitters before, or perhaps you've heard of examples like dopamine is a pretty commonly known neurotransmitter. Another one is serotonin, etc. A lot of chemicals we can use to pass messages from one neuron to another neuron, or one neuron to a muscle, or something like that. Okay, so we've got our basic parts here: cell body with the nucleus, dendrites off of that, short extensions, one long arm called the axon, which carries the signal electrical message away, think A for away, and then axon terminals, where the cell stops to terminate and is able to communicate with another cell, which is, we've got another neuron in the background here. Okay, a couple more things about the neuron. There is a covering, notice this weird like bead looking thing around the axon. That is called the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath is a fatty insulative covering on the axon that helps that electrical message make sure it gets where it's going. Okay, so like the charger on your cell phone, it's got that like plasticky cover on the outside. It's not just bare wires. And if it was, you potentially could short circuit. You know, sometimes they break and they stop working and you can see the bare wires. We do not want that happening to our neurons. So I'm going to color right over top. We know the axon's still underneath. And I'm going to add some labels too. So what I just colored was D. That's the myelin sheath, the fatty cover on the outside of the axon, and then C was the axon itself. I missed that from earlier. Now, that myelin sheath, how did it get there? What's the idea with the fatty covering? Well, it's actually produced by a cell called the Schwann cell. And this kind of gives you an idea. The Schwann cell's flat like a pancake, like a really wide pancake. And what it does is it wraps itself around and around and around, kind of like in a coil shape around the axon. And then it produces the fatty covering, kind of locks itself in place. G is the Schwann cell itself, or the nucleus of the Schwann cell anyway. And remember, it's wrapped itself around the axon to produce the fatty covering called the myelin sheath. So this is just a different view of the same thing that we're talking about. Finally, there are little gaps in the myelin sheath, and it's a complicated idea, but the reason why those little gaps are there is so the electrical message can actually skip over the myelin sheath areas and travel much faster, like significantly faster. So those gaps are named after the gentleman that discovered them. So they're called the nodes, and this is a French name, capital R, Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier. You don't have to say it with the French sound, Ranvier if you want. These are the gaps. They're called the nodes of Ranvier. Really important because myelinated axons are much faster to transmit messages than unmyelinated. So if there was no myelin sheath, there would be no nodes and the message would go way, way slower. All right, last but not least, neurons communicate with other cells at an area called the synapse. That is the communication zone. So I'm going to make a little note. The communication zone. And that is represented by this little box right here, where the very end of the axon terminal is able to communicate with this other cell. Okay, and this would be a synapse as well. And this would be a third synapse. So the communication zone is at the synapse. I'm going to outline that with a little red. This area here is the synapse. It's the communication zone. And it's always going to be the axon terminal of the first neuron with like the dendrite or cell body of the second, just like it's shown here. So it's just like passing a message along, and it uses chemicals, and those chemicals flow out of the axon terminal and land on the other cell, and the other cell starts another message. It's a pretty ingenious way to communicate. Okay, so how does this picture apply to the one previously? We've got all these parts of the cell, and all the cells are organized into nerves. So what part is this right here? This is the neuron, but what part is it? It's the long, skinny part called the axon. So I'm going to add that to our arrow from before, that this is the axon of a neuron, and that's a really important idea. So nerves are organs that are made of neurons, which are cells, and here's the cell in super zoom with all of its parts. And then don't forget that nerves are just one of the parts of the nervous system. The brain is made of neurons, the spinal cord is also made of neurons, and the nerves are made of neurons. So the primary cell of this system is the neuron. I'll see you next time.